Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green released in Japan in February of 1996, and by 1999 the rest of the world got to see the first generation Pokemon games, although they were slightly altered from the original Japanese versions of Red and Green, and the title of Green was dropped in favor of Blue internationally. We're not going to get too much into the differences between the Pokemon Green version in Japan and the Pokemon Blue version released later on in this video, but I will link an older video of mine in the description about Pokemon Green if you want to go check that one out. So everyone knows how Pokemon exploded in popularity shortly after the release of the Generation 1 Pokemon games, but were they actually good games at the time? And what about today? Did Pokemon Red and Blue age well enough to be enjoyed today, or did it not Did Pokemon Red and Blue age well enough to be enjoyed today, or did it not age well enough compared to other games from the same era? First, we have to go back to 1996 and take a look at Pokemon in Japan. Typically for a lot of games made by Japanese game developers at this time, games would release locally in Japan first, and then an international release would be considered if the game did well in Japan. This genre of game, which followed a player's journey as they caught and fought monsters via leveling up, was already a pretty popular concept in Japan thanks to older games like Dragon Quest. Pokemon Red, Green, and Blue version, which released later on in 1996 in Japan, sold over 4.5 million units combined in Japan by the end of 1997. They ended up even outselling Final Fantasy VII the year it was released, which was a huge accomplishment for a new video game franchise. No one expected Pokemon to be this big, and these events led to the international releases in the following years. This was a little bit risky at the time as Pokemon was seen as a game focused on a Japanese audience, so no one really knew for sure if the games would succeed outside of Japan. Luckily for Pokemon, the international releases were a huge success, making them one of the best-selling video games of all time. So far all we've talked about was game sales, and although a game sells well, it doesn't exactly mean it's a good game. A game selling well could be an indication that it's good, but it's not always the case. Unfortunately, I can't really find too much information about Japanese reviews from the time for Pokemon Red, Green, and Blue. Luckily, there are plenty of reviews once the game released internationally though. According to Wikipedia, Pokemon Red and Blue had very good review scores at the time in the late 90s. The average review score seems to be somewhere between an 8 and 8.5 out of 10, with IGN even giving them a 10 out of 10, and the lowest score comes from Nintendo Power, interestingly enough, giving the games a 7.2 out of 10, which isn't great, but still pretty respectable. These reviews praise Pokemon Red and Blue for the amount of unique Pokemon you can encounter in the wild, the dungeons, which I guess they mean caves, and rocket hideouts, and RPG elements that aren't too complicated when compared to other similar games at the time. The simple graphics help leave a lot to the imagination of the player as well, and although the games were seen as rather easy, they were still rather enjoyable and interesting. In IGN's final verdict for the review, they say, quote, "Pokemon really is worthy of being one of the Game Boy system's greatest games. It's not just a fad, a craze, or a trend. If you don't have this game in your library, pick one up. It doesn't matter if you pick Blue or Red, they're both the same game. You'll have to make sure you've got a friend with the other version if you want to catch them all." Looking at Nintendo Power's review, it's a bit shorter than the IGN review, but the main concern they had for the game were the graphics and the sound. The graphics are admittedly pretty bad even for the time, especially when compared to other games on the console such as Donkey Kong Land 3 or even The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, which looks a little bit better. I'm not exactly sure what they mean too much by this sound, as I personally think the music is pretty good, but I guess that due to the Game Boy's limited sound features, some parts of the game could sound a little bit different. One of the features I see praised at the time were Red and Blue's multiplayer features. At the time, there were other games that utilized the Game Boy's connectivity features, but none of them to the extent of Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. This was huge for the time, especially considering that the Game Boy was already over 7 years old by the time the games were released internationally. This allowed players to battle with friends and trade Pokemon to make completing their Pokédex a little bit easier. This had become a staple in Pokemon games ever since, and I like to think that it's the biggest reason why most people had link cables in the first place. These games were revolutionary for their time. They weren't the first of their kind, but they did do a big role in popularizing RPG games outside of Japan, as well as monster collecting games as a whole. They were definitely good games from the late 90s perspective when they first came out, but how do they hold up today? Did they age well or not? We've come a very long way since Pokemon Red and Blue first released in the 90s, with Pokemon as a game growing and improving as well as video games growing and improving as a whole. The graphics are still rather poor, as they were even considered poor by 1997 standards, but we really can't knock them too hard for that. I personally don't think that bad graphics really ruin a game as long as you're still able to play it. In terms of general gameplay, however, which I think is more important than graphics, there's a lot of things here that made Pokemon age very poorly in my opinion, and definitely worse than any other Pokemon game in the franchise. But before we continue, let's get a quick word from our sponsor. And by sponsor, I just mean me saying if you guys enjoy this video, make sure you leave a like as it does help a ton, and of course subscribe so you don't miss any future uploads. I know it sounds cliche, I know you guys will be tired of hearing this all the time from all your favorite YouTubers, but it really does go a long way just clicking that one like if you genuinely enjoy the video. I also have a Twitter and Instagram link in the description if you want to follow me over there. There's also a Discord server for the channel link in the description as well, so if you want to join and connect with me and other people who are subscribed to the channel, that's a great way to do so. And now let's get back to the video. One of the more obvious flaws would be the lack of a running feature. This is a staple in Pokemon games now, ever since it was first introduced in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. And now whenever I play a Pokemon game, I'm running as much as I can. The bike does somewhat remedy this issue a little bit, although the bike is obtained a little bit later on in the game and can be annoying to toggle on and off again if you don't have it selected in your item storage. Speaking of item storage, the limited item storage is a huge issue as well, from the very limited bag space you have on your character to the limited PC storage for your Pokemon. You could even run into an issue where if your current PC box you have selected is full and you catch a Pokemon with a full party, you won't be able to catch it since that current box is full and it won't automatically move to the next box like newer Pokemon games do. You always have to make sure that the current box you have selected isn't full, which makes organizing boxes a little bit harder. There isn't even a preview to see the Pokemon in the box, and you have to save before making a new box, which caused me to lose a lot of Pokemon in my PC when I was a kid, especially when I gave them weird nicknames that I didn't remember what they were. On top of that, we have a lot of glitches and oversights. Some of these glitches, like Missing No Glitch or the Glitch City glitches, require you to go out of your way to accomplish, which is good since you shouldn't really encounter them through regular gameplay and they can be forgiven, but there's tons of other glitches and oversights that happen while playing through the game normally that seems like they should have been pretty easy to fix. For example, super effective moves don't display properly and get confused if a Pokemon is dual typed. NPCs also have infinite PP, which is quite the oversight if you ask me, since they could just spam moves freely and make some battles harder than they need to be, and you can never stall them out. NPCs always try to go for a super effective move as well, which sounds like it would make sense, however the NPC sees non-damaging moves, like Agility for example, as super effective against Pokemon who are weak against Psychic, despite it not doing any damage. This oversight of NPCs always trying to go for super effective moves has been utilized in speedruns interestingly enough, most namely with Lance's Dragonite always spamming Agility, which is a Psychic type move which can be abused by the player. Some of these glitches and oversights are rather strange since the first Pokemon games had a pretty lengthy development time. On top of that, when they were translating the game from Japanese to other languages, mostly English, this added even more glitches, even though they were trying to fix some of the glitches that the original Japanese versions had for these international releases. By the time Red and Blue released in Europe, it was basically the third time the game's been updated, as we had the original Red and Green, then the updated Blue version, then the English and Australian version of Pokemon Red and Blue, and then the European version which released later on from the American and Australian version, and a lot of these glitches and oversights were still prevalent. So in short, Pokemon Red and Blue really didn't age well at all if you ask me. This really isn't too surprising to be fair, as it was the first game in the Pokemon series released nearly 25 years ago now, but if you're a newer Pokemon fan who didn't play Red and Blue when they were new all those years ago, then chances are you wouldn't really enjoy them too much if you were to pick them up and play them today after playing some of the newer Pokemon games. I remember this happening a little bit when Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue were released on the 3DS Virtual Console back in 2015. If you're an older Pokemon fan and grew up with them, then I'm sure you'd still enjoy them for the big nostalgia factor they have, but otherwise not so much. At least we have remake games that take place in the Kanto region that you can still enjoy, which capture a lot of the similar feelings as the original Pokemon Red and Blue. Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green released in 2004 and aged pretty well all things considered, and did a pretty good job of making Red and Blue feel more modern while still keeping faithful to the original. There's also Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, which is pretty much a remake as well, although it is technically considered a yellow remake I guess, although there are more differences than Fire Red and Leaf Green had compared to Red and Blue, as Fire Red and Leaf Green were more like 1-to-1 remakes from the original Red and Blue. So to wrap things up, Pokemon Red and Blue were a great start to the Pokemon franchise at the time they were released in the late 90s for the original Game Boy. They cemented Pokemon as a top-tier franchise in the gaming world, and although they were far from perfect, they're still some of the most influential games released in video game history.